Right, good evening and welcome to this very special event brought to you in partnership with more than 500 independent bookshops who make up the bookshop.org website. I'd like to start by thanking the independent bookshops across the UK for supporting this event. I'm Andy Rossiter, and along with my wife, Victoria, I run Rossiter Books in Ross on Wye, Monmouth, Leominster and Cheltenham. And of course, I'd like to thank everybody who's watching today who has already bought a copy of Apollo Remastered. This event is being recorded and we'll be talking for around 45 minutes, and then there will be a chance for you to ask some questions. And you can ask those questions at any time. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or option at the bottom of your screen. You can just drop a question in there and we'll select some of those to be given to Andy right at the end. So it's almost 50 years ago when the final Apollo mission, Apollo 17, launched just after midnight from Cape Canaveral en route to the moon. The Apollo missions brought back moon rocks, new scientific discoveries, and perhaps most importantly, a new way of looking back at the Earth and understanding the fragility of our own home, an oasis in the blackness of space. If all goes to plan, and that's a big if, a new series of missions, beginning with Artemis 1, will launch towards the moon, currently scheduled for Wednesday this week. So it's particularly appropriate that as we stand on the cusp of this new chapter in space exploration, that we join this evening for an event with Andy Saunders. Andy is a science writer and one of the world's foremost experts of NASA digital restoration. His photographic work has been exhibited internationally at some of the most renowned venues, most recently the Albert Hall, and he regularly makes headlines in the world press. His remastered images have also been utilized by NASA and reside in their own archives. Originally from Appley Bridge near Wigan, he graduated from Loughborough University in 1996. A lifelong Apollo obsessive, he found a way to unite two of his passions, space exploration and image restoration, by restoring the old film footage from the golden era of human space exploration. He's now the author of Apollo Remastered, displayed just here, a stunningly curated and produced book for which Andy accessed digital scans of the flight film from the vaults that contain the precious originals of the imagery brought back from the first days of space exploration. Andy, welcome to the event.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for those that have bought the book. Hope you're enjoying it so far. Thanks to you, Andy. Thanks to bookshop.org. Thanks to Mark, whose idea this was when he popped down to the Royal Albert Hall a couple of months ago. So yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Brilliant. I said I was first aware of this book back in the spring when I was walking around the London Book Fair and saw the stunning cover image there. So I've been intrigued by it ever since. So it's a particular pleasure to be hosting this evening. So look, let's start at the beginning. When did you first start on this path that set you working on these images?
I mean, my passion for Apollo has been for as long as I can remember. As a child, I just obsessed with the Apollo moon landings. I can't really pinpoint where it started or why. I'd always been fascinated with anything that could fly. I was always making paper airplanes and little parachutes throwing out the window and boomerangs, helicopters, but like rockets really, for a lot of little boys, I think, were like the ultimate flying machine. You know, the power and the noise and the speed. And so I remember being obsessed with rockets as well. And the moon itself, again, I can't really pinpoint why, but I do remember receiving a small telescope for Christmas, probably one from Argos, just a very cheap small telescope. And I remember looking at the moon through that and just being struck by how this two-dimensional silver disk in the sky instantly became this a bit more three-dimensional. Like a world that you could potentially go and visit. You know, it almost felt like I'd been transported there and I could kind of fly over the surface. And then when I learned that, well, actually people have done that, I was just amazed and just upset. I needed to know everything about it. Who were these people? what did they look like? What did the spacecraft look like? How big was the rocket? Because I was very into rockets. This seemed like the ultimate journey in a rocket to go to the moon. So right back from childhood, I've been obsessed with it. And that childlike fascination, I guess, has never really left me entirely. I mean, I've kind of had waves of enthusiasm throughout my life. And I think as I've got older, it's just more now this growing appreciation of how absolutely incredible this achievement was, particularly as the missions go further into the past. So we've been celebrating a lot of the 50th anniversaries, as you mentioned. Apollo 17, 50th anniversary is coming up in December. So that's our last steps on the moon. You know, they were flying these rudimentary looking spacecraft. They were taking it for today's standards, incredibly high risk to go and venture off into the unknown and walk on another world. So although the childlike fascination is still there, it's more this growing appreciation for that and the history. But ever since being very young, I was very conscious that something extremely important was missing, because I wanted to see the first man on the moon. I wanted to see Neil Armstrong, and I couldn't. And that's just always, that image has been missing from the history books. And that's when it was not long after the 40th anniversary, the HD film transfers of this small movie, 16mm movie footage that they took, that was released. And that's when I tried to apply this quite unusual technique, this stacking technique, to that footage to try and produce that image that I felt was always missing. And really the reaction to that and how I felt when I produced that image was kind of the catalyst to then go and assess the whole back catalogue of Apollo imagery.
And that's quite a vast back catalogue, isn't it? That's I mean, say how many images you actually went through to produce this book.
Well, they took 35,000. So yeah, I spent kind of 10,000 hours going through those. And then the need to do that was you might as well, why? Of course, there was this Armstrong image, as I've mentioned. Why go through 35,000 of the Hasselblad images? But part of the reason is because they did take so many, and yet we see the same ones over and over again. We always have. So my thoughts were, gosh, well, there must be some photographs in there that we tend to never see, either because they're not great quality, or maybe because it's just by default we pick the same ones over and over again. But the images that were captured, because of where they were, are inherently stunning. I thought there must be thousands of incredible images. But also the biggest reason is the frustration of the quality of what we've always seen. This is an example. So you think about this moment. This is Apollo 11. So Armstrong and Aldrin they've undertaken the moonwalk. They've got back into the relative safety of the lunar module. They've taken the helmets off, and they're contemplating the enormity of what they've just achieved. And Aldrin captures this moment. It captures Armstrong, and it's absolutely brilliant portrait. It tells us so much. You can see this expression in his face. You can feel kind of almost like an atmosphere in this old-looking spacecraft, this analog-looking spacecraft. But I think we just get used to the fact that, oh, well, it's an amazing image, and we don't think about technically it's awful. This is straight from NASA's website. This doesn't make any sense. The color's wrong. There's so much detail evidently missing. And it is evidently missing because they used the best cameras, the best film, the best photo lab, the best lenses. It didn't make sense that we're seeing these images like this. So at that point, I hunted down the best source footage I could for this particular shot, actually. And I worked on it, and I produced, hopefully you got the after image, this version. And this is how we should be seeing these moments. Now we can see all this detail in his suit. We can see the NASA badge. We can see Armstrong written across his chest. The color's right. We can see much more of the expression in his face. And if you look closely, we can actually see he's got kind of slightly red, teary eyes. Now, Armstrong was, all of the astronauts back in the day were these hard-nosed test pilots, fighter pilots. They were trained to subdue emotion. Emotion just gets in the way of making the correct decisions. You're going to the moon, you can't be emotional. And Armstrong was the absolute epitome of that. So it would be very unusual if this is emotion. It could be moon dust, irritation. The moon dust was quite an irritant. It could be tiredness. It could be dry air. But maybe was kind of slightly overwhelmed at this moment, like say, contemplating the enormity of what they'd achieved.
And so why were the images so bad in the first place? You knew that they were using the absolute best equipment. So what was the reason for the poorness of the images?
There's two reasons really. The main reason is almost everything we've ever seen has been based on duplicate film. So Kodak developed this very thin-based photographic film so that you can fit basically more shots on a roll, because weight and space when you go into the moon is very important. So it's very, very thin, delicate film. So when that got back from the moon, of course, this is incredibly important, the moments that were captured on it. You don't want to be handling that multiple times. So they instantly made a master set, and that original film went into this frozen vault in Houston. Here it is on screen, and has been almost untouched since. And then everything we've seen has been based on that duplicate set. They would make copies of the duplicate set. They would make internegatives of those copies. Then they'd make a copy of an internegative and send it to the magazines and newspapers of the day. Remember, we were in an analog world for the first 25 years. So anything that was then seen in print was multiple generations away from the original. And at every generation, there's a degradation in quality. As we moved into the digital world, the problem has been, there's been low quality scanning technology, and there were scans of that duplicate film. So, and then with the internet world, people will make a copy, a JPEG, and then save another JPEG and put it on social media. Someone will copy it and brighten it, and then it goes on. And at every step, there's a degradation in quality. And I had this moment where this concept of these incredibly important photographs are getting progressively worse as they're being seen by progressively more people online. And that drove me nuts, and it didn't make sense, and it shouldn't be the case. So thankfully, quite recently, that original film, so this is the film that was actually in the cameras on the moon, made it out of the frozen vault and was scanned. So NASA undertook the scanning, and then they made the digital raw files, the outputs, available. So this is an example of the scanning in process, and they are incredibly high resolution, high bit depth. Everything that was in that film is captured on these scans. They were beyond the resolution of the film grain, even of the film. Huge bit depth, and we can just pull out, but it's ultimately still analog film. So they tend to be very dark. So you still need to apply digital processing to get the best out of them. So that was kind of where the work was involved in doing that.
Okay. So on the screen, this is an example at the moment, isn't it? So on the screen, you can hardly see anything here. And this is the cover shot, isn't it? So can you talk us through this one?
Yeah. So like I said, the film, in fact, I don't know if it's easier if I show you. This is some duplicate film. So this is kind of what we're looking at. So I don't know if you can see there. Of course, it's not a negative. Actually, I don't know if you can make out there. It's a positive image. The color images, positive image. The correct color actually resides on the film. So that film that was in the cameras. So that scan is effectively a digital photograph of that piece of film, and that's what we've got. And so of course that film is very dark. It wasn't designed to be digitally scanned back in the 60s. It was designed to have light shining through it, so it'd be exposed on light sensitive paper to make a photograph or to be projected. So the scans of the film are very dark, but also some of the original shots were underexposed. So there's kind of a double whammy. So this is a particularly underexposed example. So when I'm going through these 35,000, we'll call them negatives, I'm looking for anything that gives me a clue as to what might be in them. Is there anything, worthy of trying to pull some detail out? And this one, I could see this little window that you can see here. And in the corner, you can see a little purple square. And I recognize that as the COAS site, the Crewman Optical Alignment site. So effectively a guidance site. And they use this during docking, for example. So I thought, oh, there might be something interesting in that one. And then as I started to stretch the contrast and pull some of the detail out from this high bit depth file, I could tell instantly there's something incredible in it. And it was Commander Jim McDivitt. But when we pushed the processing hard, it didn't look anything like this. But this was the image that I knew was kind of the goal. When you push the processing so hard, you get all kinds of artifacts that just ruin the shot. And that's where the time comes in, trying to balance the frame, get the contrast in every element, every area of this piece of film, if you like, correct, and pull the detail out and get the color right. And that's tedious, incredibly tedious. But, you know, I could see instantly this is going to be an incredible shot. You know, it's a cinematic, atmospheric shot of the commander of Apollo 9 undertaking his work in 1969. And I just love how it looks like he's looking up in wonder, which gives it that cinematic feel. But actually, the reality is even better. So I researched every photograph that's in the book, and there's captions to say, you know, what can we see in them? Who took the photograph? When was it taken? Get the chronology right. What the astronauts saying at the time to put them into context. And I spoke to Rusty Schweikart, who actually took this photograph. And he confirmed, yeah, in this moment, actually, Jim is undertaking the first ever docking in space between two crewed spacecraft, and where the astronauts then, you know, go through the tunnel from one into the other. So it's a very historic moment, and the stakes were very high because this was also the first time we had humans in a spacecraft that was incapable of getting them home, because this was Apollo 9. They were testing the lunar module in Earth orbit. And so normally you'd land on the moon in the lunar module, come back to the command module, and then you've got a heat shield on the command module to get back through Earth's atmosphere. Here, so they're in the lunar module with no heat shield. The heat shield was where on the command module that they were trying to dock to. So you imagine this is the first time it's ever happened. And if they didn't get this right, they were in big trouble. So the stakes were very high. And Rusty said, I can't express to you just how hard a task this is for a pilot, because the other complexities at this stage, they had the lunar module controls were set up to look out of the window as if you're landing on the moon like this. But in this scenario of doing a docking in Earth orbit, Jim's looking up through the docking window above him. So he actually had to translate all of the movement through 90 degrees in his head, live, undertaking the first ever docking. And if he didn't, he had no heat shield. I mean, it's just an incredibly high pressure moment. So it's just, you know, it was a no-brainer for the front cover, you know, this atmospheric look, a historic moment. And when you think about what he's actually doing in that moment.
And there's, I mean, this image in particular, I think, is kind of start. I read that you sometimes sort of feel a bit like an archaeologist as you're kind of working, and nothing sort of demonstrates this more than I think this image. And as you say, it's just a stunning, you know, the kind of texture on the suit,
yeah,
as well at the bottom, and you can't quite see the bubble helmet, but until you see the silver at the top, it's
yeah. You can't quite see that on Zoom. You can just about see it on the file, and I think just about in the book. So it's actually the only photograph of an Apollo astronaut flying a lunar module in the full suit and helmet as well. You know, it's got out of 35,000 photographs. So yeah, a bit like an archaeologist. Yeah, when you kind of pulling that detail out, it's like you're brushing the dust off something and revealing a piece of history. You know, it feels like, yeah, it's quite an addictive process, actually. That's what kind of kept me going through 35,000 of them, finding the next gem.
Just in case you miss one.
Yeah.
So the image changed. So as well as working on the original film for the still photographs, there are images based on the stacking principle that you mentioned earlier. Now, I'd never heard of this technique until my teenage son developed a passion for astrophotography and kind of explained it to me. But can you explain it to us? What is stacking?
It's really hard to explain. It's like you say, it's used in astrophotography. So rather than taking a single image, say someone's imaging Mars, you would take a video of it, and therefore you're getting hundreds of frames. And on each separate frame, the noise is in a different place. And particularly with astrophotography.
So what's noise?
So every image has got two main components. It's the signal, which is the image that you want to see, and noise. Can be digital noise, can be noise from the film, can be noise from the scanning process. So it's those bits of fuzziness that get in the way of seeing the signal. but that noise is in a random place on every frame, but the signal is in the same place on every frame. So if the best way to imagine it, so here on the left, we've got some 16mm film. If you imagine it as kind of negative film, it's slightly transparent. So let's say we're in an analog world. If you imagine cutting those 4 frames and stacking them on top of each other, as we've got here, and perfectly aligning them and then squishing them together and looking through it, you can imagine that signal, the image is kind of denser, it's stronger. But because the noise is in a random place, that stays about the same. So you can look at it in 2 ways. You're getting a stronger signal and you're not getting stronger noise, or what typically happens with this, we're doing it digitally, is you keep the signal and you average out the noise. So, but it's an incredibly powerful process. I'm constantly amazed when it comes out the other end at the difference. So when you're effectively taking data from lots of sources rather than one, is another way of thinking about it.
And I know in that image you just had, you had a kind of a demonstration of 4 images.
Yeah.
But how many images, up to how many images were you stacking sometimes for this book?
I think the most was probably 300 or 400. Typically about even 3 or 4 frames. So the improvement in the signal to noise ratio is equal to the square root of the number of frames. There's a lovely fact to take to the pub with you next Friday. So even 3 frames, you do get a good improvement, and it kind of tapers off a little bit, but the optimum is kind of 60 to 80 frames. But when I'm going through these looking for scenes so this is, if you imagine like a cine film camera, we're looking at moving scenes. When I can see that actually I could get, say, 300 frames, that's when I get I just think this is going to stack amazingly well. And we can almost go, I mean, here's an example. So this is actually a very small section of 1 frame. This is from a piece of film on Apollo 8. So our first mission to the moon without landing. This is movie footage. So this is 1 frame. And then if you move to the next one, I think it's 80 frames. So you might want to, if you can, kind of switch between the 2 and see the difference. You know, we can almost now read that. We can't quite, we can almost read that document. And in 1 frame, that data just isn't there. But in lots of frames together, you see the noise. We're zoomed in very close here, so there's still some noise, but you can see the vast majority of that noise goes. And then you can also then push the processing a bit harder. So we're getting the benefit of stacking, and then you're able to process harder as well. So we end up with what looks like an awful grainy piece of cine footage, and end up with something that's almost of photographic quality with detail we've never been able to see before.
Incredible. So look, we've picked a few example images from the book. So can you talk us through this one? And we'll start with the obvious one, the one you mentioned at the start, the Armstrong image.
Yeah. So this was, like I say, this was this frustration of not having an image of the first man on the moon. I want to see him on the moon, and we couldn't because he held the camera. You know, they took 1 camera onto the lunar surface. You know, can you imagine when the first woman walks on the moon with Artemis in 5 or 6 years, perhaps? We'll have thousands of her from every angle. But we took 1 camera, and they got back, and they were looking for a photograph of the first man on the moon, and they couldn't find one because there were actually some kind of his back or of his ankle or a bit of his backpack, but not a clear shot of Armstrong on the moon. So that's when I had the idea of that stacking process. If you can put Mars through it, why can't we put Neil Armstrong through it? So that's what I did. Lifted several frames because he was still at this moment. This was not long after he'd got onto the surface. He was putting a contingency sample, preparing it to put in his pocket, and so he stayed still quite for a few moments or so. Could lift several almost identical frames, stack them, so that principle of the noise and getting the data from lots of samples. And when I was processing the output, I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. You know, I knew what it meant. Not only we've got this nice image of Armstrong, of course, his visor's up, we can see a face. Not only is it a face, if you know your space history, I was like, my God, that's recognizably Neil Armstrong. No, recognize, and we hardly ever even see an astronaut, an Apollo astronaut with the visor up, but we happen to have one of Armstrong. Because his eyelid, you know, the detail that was coming out, and it was almost like I'd gone back in time. Something I've always kind of dreamt of being able to do, go back in time and position myself and just observe these incredibly historic moments unfold before my eyes. And that's how it felt when I was processing this. And this is what got me, hooked on the process.
Why just so I know you're going to go through more, but so these images were released by NASA. They did the rescanning. You've used the images that they very generously sort of made publicly available.
Yeah.
Why do you think they never did this themselves? They just didn't realize the potential of the stacking process?
The stacking process is a little bit different. So the stacking process, actually, I got access to that film via somebody else, via a guy called Stephen Slater. He ended up with these HD cam HD transfers, and he supplied me with those very generously. The Hasselblad, most of the images in the book are the Hasselblads, and that's where, yes, we've got now access to scans of the original film. So I don't think, it's not a very obvious thing to stack film footage. It's quite an unusual thing to do. It requires a huge amount of time and effort. In terms of the Hasselblads, why didn't they process those? I mean, the project of getting all of that film out of the freezer, these 35,000 images, scanning them and making those raw files available is a huge task in itself. I'd started to access them not long after that project was finished. Why they hadn't done it, again, maybe it's time, maybe it's, they are aware that people with the enthusiasm and the time and the skills will go and do this anyway. They like, they haven't sponsored this in any way, but they like what I've done. It's celebrating their past. I send them the remastered versions back, and sometimes they use them for their purposes. And it's getting people excited about Artemis. So although they like what I'm doing, it was never a NASA sponsored thing.
Right. So on the screen at the moment is a very famous image, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this is forget Apollo. This is perhaps one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. It's Buzz Aldrin. If you look closely, you can see Neil Armstrong in the reflection. So previous to that last image, this was considered perhaps one of the best images we have of Armstrong on the moon. We were that desperate, that we're looking at something in a reflection of Buzz Aldrin. But frustratingly, when we see this image, it's often been desaturated. So, like I say, as well as you can't just take a scan of a piece of film and just present it, you need to digitally process it. And I think anyone that digitally processes them has got this misconception that the moon must be totally grey, perfectly grey, and the spacesuit must be perfectly white. It's an easy assumption, and therefore, if we see any colour, they'll just edit that out, which is really frustrating, because actually the moon does have colour, first of all. And in this particular shot, if you look, the sun is behind Aldrin, so light doesn't really, because there's no atmosphere, there's no bits in the atmosphere, light doesn't scatter in the same way as it does on Earth. It's very direct. So because he's illuminated from behind, his front is illuminated almost entirely by reflected light. And if you look at where that reflected light is coming from, you can see in his visor and in the bottom right there, he's standing next to Eagle, the lunar module, which is wrapped in this shiny gold Kapton material. So that light reflects off Eagle, his lunar module that got him there, onto his suit and bathes him in this really attractive orange gold light. And that's not something you should edit out. It's a vital part of the visual storytelling of what is an iconic image. So yeah, getting the color right in the images has been something I've been very keen to do. Yeah, getting the accuracy.
Fantastic. And this is a kind of panorama shot. So is that from the Hasselblad photographs?
No, so this is from the 16mm stacking. It looks almost photographic because of that stacking technique. This is Apollo 13, so that's Fred Hayes there resting. He was very sick at this point. This is on the way back from the moon in this kind of lifeboat. So anyone that's watched the movie or knows about Apollo 13 knows that there was an explosion 200,000 miles from Earth. We didn't know at this point. They didn't really know if they'd get home alive, but thankfully, they had the presence of mind to roll the camera and record anyway. And I love this because that's Jim Lovell's hand on the left. So he's filming his spacecraft, his ship, and his resting crew on the way back from the moon. And on the left there's the CO2 scrubber, which again, if anyone that's seen the film or knows the history knows that, you know, they were poisoning themselves with their breath until they cobbled together this CO2 scrubber. And what I want to do with the book is create this almost intimate feel. So we tend not to see images of the astronauts. We see a puffy white spacesuit and a gold visor. I've always wanted to step on board the spacecraft and look inside, look at the people. What are they doing? Look at this gloriously analog control panel you can see on the right. Ride along with these space explorers. Look out of that window. What was it like looking out that window at the Earth as it sinks away into the blackness? And I want to see it how they saw it. So that's a lot of the motivation, and a lot of what I've tried to do in the book is reveal the human side to the missions.
Yeah. I mean, look, you really do that well, and the extra detail. I know it's born out of hours and hours and a massive amount of research. So no, you've done incredibly well here. So what's happened here? It looks like you might be about to duck if you're an astronaut.
Yeah. There are some images that I went through which don't necessarily need a huge amount of enhancement or don't necessarily reveal some new minute details. Some just instantly convey the awe-inspiring nature of human space exploration, and this was one of them. I mean, this is heavily cropped, so having these huge resolution scans now allows us to crop. I try not to do it in the book, and it actually doesn't happen very often, because again, a crop or a slightly awkward shot is all part of the visual storytelling as well. You know, it's taken by a human. But some of the shots are absolutely made by being able to zoom in and present something like this. And, you know, I asked Charlie Duke about this. He confirmed he took this photograph. He's in the lunar module, and he's taken a photograph of another spacecraft that's also flying over the moon. And in there is Ken Mattingly, his crewmate. And then adjacent to him is this amazing crescent Earth, you know, 250,000 miles away. This planet from where the moon's human visitors came from in these bizarre looking spacecraft. So there are images like this in the book that just instantly convey the enormity of what they were doing. So that's the command module. Yeah, we can see on the left.
And is that sort of an optical illusion because it's so clear and it actually rises much higher in the sky, or
yeah, they're probably about 60 miles above the surface.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible. And so what are we looking at here? Which what scene is this?
Well, this is Apollo 17. So yeah, approaching the 50th anniversary. This is a great one just to showcase the panoramas. So the astronauts were taught to take panoramic sequences. So they take a photograph, turn 20 degrees, take a photograph, turn 20 degrees. It's not like today with our smartphones where we just kind of zip it across and it all gets merged together. They had to do it manually. So this is 9 shots that I remastered from the original flight film and then manually stitched together. And the rationale of taking these panoramas wasn't so we can drool over them half a century later. It was kind of a scientific, in terms of the geologic sampling and referencing and that kind of thing. But they are great at just displaying this incredible, the grandeur of the lunar landscape. And there's a tiny earthling, that's Jack Schmitt. If you look off to the left, you can just about see the tracks that the rover made. And you just imagine making that drive and then coming up onto that rim and the view they must have had. And you can also see quite a lot of colour in this, which, as I say, the moon isn't entirely grey. It does have colour. So there's quite a lot of colour variance in this, including some orange. So this is where they found orange soil, bright orange soil.
Very good. And actually, oh yeah, and look at this. So what is this? Is a picture of the book. So tell us a bit about how you've put the book together.
Yeah, I mean, the design concept really was almost like as you turn the page, you're walking through a gallery. So the image has to be the absolute star of the show. It's got a very simple, clean design, a black border. The text, if that was in a white, it would just completely steal your eye from the image. But I was still keen to get the information, this extra context on each page. So that's what we did, is have this very clean design, this moon grey text underneath. And there was a lot of research went into, like I say, finding out exactly when the photographs were taken, the chronology so that we can look at each mission and follow the story of each mission, follow the story of the whole program. Or even from our first photograph of the curvature of Earth through to walking on the moon on Apollo 11 and all the way to our last steps on the moon on Apollo 17. And those that do have the book, I think maybe most people on here will notice just how black, trying to ensure that we get across this intense black that the astronauts talked of. So I was lucky enough to get several of the Apollo astronauts to give me tips and to critique what I'd done to make sure this is accurate. This is how they experience things. And one of the things, Charlie Duke, for example, in particular, said to get across, we Earthlings just can't comprehend this level of black. And I said, well, you know, if I go into an incredibly dark room and close my eyes, it's amazingly, but he said, no, that's not it. It's almost like it's got a texture, like a black velvet, intensely black. And that's contrasted with this intensely white, bright sunlight because it hasn't been filtered through the atmosphere. So that gives you this enormous contrast. And also everything from, if you imagine looking at something, a mountain range on Earth, because of the atmosphere, even if it's not foggy, as you go further into the distance, there's that slight haze so you can judge distance and it gets a bit blurry. But on the moon, you don't have that. There's no atmosphere. So it's just as clear at the fingertips as it is on the horizon. So when I was editing these photographs, I was, you know, the processing techniques are so powerful. I was conscious of, these look incredible. Am I over processing? But in fact, understanding that visual, if anything, I was under processing. It is this incredibly vivid look. So getting that right, and to get these deep blacks, that's where we applied a varnish to every photograph to get that contrast and those deep blacks.
And it's amazing that you had access, or you gained access to astronauts like Charlie Duke to actually say, you know, is this right? I mean, what an incredible thing to have. Been able to.
Yeah, there were quite a few of them were really helpful. I mean, I had a chat with Jim McDivitt, who's on the cover. Sadly, he passed away only very recently, but he was very old. So some of the astronauts I could get a limited amount from, really, but some of them are still so sharp, such as Rusty Schweikart. You know, I had an hour on Zoom with him discussing the most minute detail and his memory and his enthusiasm. It was, that was for someone who's been an enthusiast. I mean, that was incredible. And to hear the feedback, you know, they've received the book and what they feel about the book, that's been amazing.
Well, I mean, from a space enthusiast myself, I've got to say it's a wonderfully put together book. I love I also love the sort of the mission badges and the information that you have at the start, which is just incredible. And I don't know, it's not as if under each of these images you've got masses and masses of text, but I think you've done really well at sort of picking out those interesting facts. One of the really interesting ones that I found out about that I thought maybe you could talk about was the lunar excursion modules, the LEMs. Now, I'd always assumed that, and I think read that, you know, obviously they only really had enough fuel to come back off the lunar surface, and then the moon's gravity would eventually sort of bring them back again, and they would crash. But that wasn't the case, you pointed out, for Apollo 10. Can you tell us a bit about
that? Well, we think that's still in an orbit around the sun. In fact, a UK astronomer did some research on that, and it may even kind of captured it. It's very difficult to tell. I'd also done seen some research recently that actually Eagle might still be in orbit around the moon. So the assumption was that had eventually impacted, but there's been some analysis done that suggests that actually it might not have done. So yeah, most of them were purposely sent on a course to impact the moon, partly so they could then measure with the instruments that they had, the experiments that they left, measure kind of moon quakes and that kind of thing. So there was a scientific benefit of crashing stuff into the moon, which just now 50 years later, you just think, well, if we only somehow we could get them home. But gosh, if Eagle's there, you know, if Elon Musk can somehow get up there and bring it home, that would be the most incredible exhibit I could possibly dream of.
appearing at the Smithsonian sometime, maybe in the future.
Yeah.
Andy, let's take some questions. So Jacqueline, I can see on the chat, said, why are there no stars in the sky in the pictures?
Very, very, very common question. It's not really any different to why there aren't stars when you take a photograph on Earth in the day. You know, you adjust the camera to the brightness of what you're photographing, which is, say, the surface of the moon. Now, the surface of the moon is incredibly reflective. The astronauts compare it to a snowfield on Earth on a sunny day. It's unbelievably bright. So when you stop down the camera such that it's not too bright, there's the difference in the amount of light versus a star is there's just no way you could capture the stars. Now, actually, they did capture Venus accidentally on a couple of shots, but it takes a bit of processing to find those. In fact, there's one in the book on Apollo 14 that Alan Shepard captured. He leant back from the lunar module. He captured the lunar module and a crescent Earth. Whether he could see Venus as well, and he was trying to capture it, we don't actually know. But again, some people have done some analysis. The software where you can say, okay, I'm on the moon in this year on this date, and I'm looking back, where are all the planets? And lo and behold, Earth and Venus, you can superimpose them on these photographs that he took. They're in exactly the right place. So actually, that's also the kind of thing that, you know, moon hoax people, you know, that's another piece of evidence whereby I almost edited them out, you know. So I'm going through these negatives and spot healing, because you get dust and all kinds of artifacts on the film. So I almost edited it, and I noticed it was on 5 consecutive frames in the same place. And that's when I started to do the research and found out actually it's Venus. So if someone can tell me that when someone was trying to do, you know, to fake the moon landings, that they would fake 5 pieces of negative film, there'd be bits of dust on it. One of the bits of dust to be in exactly the same place on 5 frames. And lo and behold, in 50 years, someone might have some software that realizes that that's exactly where Venus needs to be. Absolutely no chance. So, yeah, so they did capture Venus occasionally, but the stars, impossible, unless you've got super fast film.
Another good riposte given by you, Andy, for a night in the pub when somebody challenges it.
Yeah.
Another question: have you had any other responses from the surviving Apollo astronauts to the book?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, getting those involved during the book, I was getting their feedback all the time. It was particularly nice to get feedback from Jim McDivitt. So we rushed a copy of the book to him. You know, I wanted him to have a copy and to see him on the cover. It's quite, a lot of people say he's not the most obvious person to have on the cover of a book to do with Apollo. You know, he didn't go to the moon, for example. But those that are who, you know the history, he's incredibly well thought of. He became, you know, involved in Apollo 12 through to Apollo 6. He kept involved, even though he didn't go back to the moon, in the management at NASA. And we rushed a copy of the book to him, and he received it a few weeks before he passed. So to get his feedback that he loved being on the cover, he thought he looked very handsome, and, you know, all this kind of thing was that was particularly gratifying.
Very good. I've got another question from Martin, who says, this is stunning, and it's whetting my appetite for the next book on Gemini. Any teasers for that?
I mean, there's some Gemini photographs in the book. So the first chapter is a pre-Apollo chapter. And it is actually one of my favorite chapters in the book. You might say, oh, you would say that, but I think anyone that's got it will probably appreciate it. The photography is a little bit different to Apollo. Of course, Apollo is predominantly moon. Gemini will be predominantly Earth, so there's more color. They had a slightly different camera. So they took, particularly on the latter missions in Gemini, they took a Hasselblad super wide camera, which had a wider angle lens, and it was better at capturing the inside of the spacecraft, capturing a bigger portion of the curvature of Earth. And the photography from Gemini is just absolutely stunning. It's got a particular feel to it. So I'm just looking forward to, clearly I've done some work on the images already, but I'm looking forward to getting through every single one of those as well, and all of the movie footage. Yeah, so that's next, Gemini Remastered.
Will you go back? Carl asks whether you'll go back as far as Mercury.
Yes, so I've done, for the 6th anniversaries of the Mercury missions, I've been putting out, particularly on social media, stacked images of them in the Mercury capsule. So the photography out of the window on Mercury or out of the portholes isn't that attractive. Unfortunately, they didn't take that many of them. They weren't that adept at using the cameras. There's some very historic ones, you know, the first of the curvature of Earth, the first of a sunrise or a sunset. But most of the interesting images are of the people. So Mercury will probably be in Gemini, in the Gemini book.
Okay. Andy, let me ask you. So I know you were doing this as a kind of a passion sort of project, and we were actually working at the time. But at what point did the idea that you would turn, you would actually pull all of this together in a book occur to you? How long had you been working on doing these?
So I produced that Armstrong image actually, so 40th anniversary just after, so it's probably around 2012. But I held on to that image until the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 to release it. When that did really well, it's front cover of the Telegraph and what have you, and people's reaction to it is really good, and I enjoyed doing it. And like I say, having that flight film available and knowing what I could do with that, that's when I decided no one else was doing it. I love doing it. I can do it. I'm going to do it. So I just decided I was taking on the project. I knew it was probably going to be years to complete it, but I just felt it's something that had to be done, and I would enjoy doing it. And I didn't actually know at the time I was going to do a book. I didn't even know what I was going to do with images. I just thought I'll end up with a catalogue that I'll either send to NASA or just put them on some online database for people to enjoy. I've always shared them on social media. And then it was kind of through that process, really, that particularly on Twitter, I add some context to the photographs as well. And people liked having the visual and having the information, and suggested doing a book. And then I thought, actually, yeah, book's perfect to be able to showcase the images and have the captions and have some information with them. So that's when I got an agent, and then we got the book deal, and that was that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Andy, what are the cameras behind you? They don't look particularly modern. What are those?
They're not very modern, no. So these are the Hasselblads. One of them's a real one of them unfortunately isn't. So this is a Hasselblad 500 EL. So this is, I got lucky with an eBay purchase, this one, because this happens to be from 1968. So it's the exact year and the exact model that they were adapting to become the moon cameras. There would be a lens on there, but I couldn't afford the lens. This is a motor at the bottom. This is the film magazine. So you can see how bulky, you get 200 photographs on that. So you think of a micro SD card now, get thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. Just for 200, you needed something like that. So they adapted these cameras to be used in space. So first of all, to aim the camera or to compose a shot, this is what you used to do. You used to have to look down here. There was a mirror that looked out at the lens, so you could kind of do this. Well, you can't do that in a helmet in a very cramped capsule whilst trying to look out the window. So all of this was taken out. So actually there was no viewfinder. So they effectively trained to simply point the camera in the right place in order to get the shot. They got so good at it. I mean, in those 35,000 photographs, it's incredible how many were right on the money. There was also no automated focus or no automated exposure, so they had to set that. They had to take the leather off because the leather and the adhesives could off gas onto the optics. All kinds of things happen in the extreme temperatures and the vacuum of space. Things like the lubricants in the lens, they had to replace. So the only automated feature was they had this motor that had, you could take a shot and it would automatically wind the camera so that you could take another one. Amazing technology. Anyway, so that became, certainly for the lunar surface, what they call a HDC. So this is just a exact replica. They also had a trigger assembly. So on the original camera, that's kind of your shutter release. Now that's very difficult to press in a bulky spacesuit. So they made that a lot bigger, this black square. And then on the lunar surface, in fact, it was Neil Armstrong's idea, was to put this on a trigger and to fix it to the chest, because they needed to keep the hands free to do the science, pick up rocks. You don't want to keep putting a camera down and in the dust and picking it up again. So it kind of clipped to the RCU, which was on the chest, and there was a little trigger that they could take the shots. They had oversized kind of, I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can see here, these kind of oversized paddles here, so that can adjust the focus. And there was kind of click stop. So as they're turning that, they could also feel it click, and that's F11. Click again, that's F8. Click again, that's F5.6. So doing all of this whilst they're on the moon in these extreme conditions, trying to compose photographs, getting the focus right, and like I say, an incredible proportion of them, because the training was so good, were brilliant. I barely had to do any cropping or rotating.
It's really good. Mark asks, not everyone in space is a space enthusiast. Perhaps we have too many problems on Earth, or or even within the space community, we can send robots to investigate and explore. What have you discovered in spending so much time with the astronauts and their Apollo journeys that you can tell people as to why we need humans in space? Sorry, Mark, I didn't do justice to that question.
No, I think I know what you mean. Obviously, robotic missions are doing absolutely incredible things. You think about the rovers we got on Mars, but you just can't replace a human eyes, human brain, someone like Jack Schmitt on Apollo 17, the kind of rocks that he could select and bring back. But also, for me, it's just an inherent human quality that we have to explore. You think it's just in us, isn't it? You think of a toddler, they're born to explore. As soon as they can crawl, if they're capable of crawling, they will go and they'll be in the kitchen cupboards. And when they can walk, they'll go into the living room. And when they can get a bus into town, they'll go into, and then they'll go, if you can go to Australia, go to, in Kennedy's speech, in fact, in 1961, he referenced Mallory, why go and climb the highest mountain? Because I think I can, and it's there. Well, we can go to the moon. We're capable of going and exploring, and to be able to and not to do is almost unhuman. So of course there's a balance, but what I found going through these images is the ones that really hit home. Images like the blue marble on Apollo 17 or Earthrise, looking back at Earth. If that photograph was taken by a robotic mission, it would have impact. You'd say, oh yeah, wow, look at the Earth, this